Welcome to Presence, a global conversation for a new earth, with hosts Doug King and Cody Deese.
Thank you, everybody, and welcome to the studios of beautiful Decula, Georgia, here on the Presence property. We are excited and ready to go today, and I am here with the man, Cody Deese. Cody.
Hi, everybody.
Good to see you.
It's good to see you and all of our listeners. I currently have in my left hand a large unsweet tea from the Christian food chain itself, Chick-fil-A.
Be careful with that because this is a 30-minute podcast.
Guys, I'm very sensitive to caffeine.
Well, not only that, hey, you drink so that's a big tea and it's a diuretic. I'm just thinking.
What is that? Yep.
Could have a problem there, but no, that's great.
So I'm fired up. I'm ready to go. We have a lot to talk about. This is part 4 of a series on faith.
Yeah.
And we have heard your cries, people. First of all, before we get started, keep sending us emails. Yeah. So we're even talking about what's next after this series, and we've got a lot of ideas, but we'd love to hear from you. If there are conversations that you would love to hear us take a stab at, please send us that. If there are things that you've heard on previous podcasts that maybe there's some confusions or questions or you want to take it further, let us know that. You can go to presence.tv and you can find on our brand new website, and you can find contact info there. And send us some feedback. You guys have been doing that a lot more in the last month or two than ever before. So we're grateful for all of you that listen all over the world. Actually, people just listening everywhere. Yeah. It's pretty amazing. I think I didn't realize how many people listen from how many different places around the world.
Yeah, and it really shows that this truly is a global conversation for a new earth, the new earth in which we live. It is global. So it's very exciting. And this faith group of podcasts that we're doing is also very exciting because, man, we're doing some heavy-duty reframing.
We are. So we're essentially, as we do almost every podcast, is we are deconstructing kind of first-tier view of faith. We're redefining faith, we're reframing faith, and we are on all of these conversations attempting to look at, explore, and shed light on what an integral perspective looks like with various subjects. And it just so happens that we were talking about salvation, and that led into a conversation about faith. And so that's what we're doing today. Good God, today it's loaded. Like, we need to get into it right now. And this is almost like a sermon today. So if you need a good sermon, I want to, and what I mean by that is, like, I want to read a text and then I want us to just go at it. And I want to put a little, like, we need to put some context around what Paul's talking about. And it's all in a trajectory towards this idea of being justified by faith.
Yes, we're headed there. We are going to get there. I know a lot of people are anxious to get there, but like most subjects, there's quite a bit that's said about it in the narrative. And in order to really get an appreciation for what is actually being said, rather than pick and choose 1 or 2 verses and then you and I go on and forming our own denomination, we're attempting to take a look at the whole swath of what's been said about faith from all the way from Genesis forward.
Okay, can I read? How about I just read this text?
Go.
This is Galatians 4.
Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you have a copy of Scripture, Galatians chapter 4 is...
You can get a Bible at any bookstore.
That's true, where I want to read. Okay, we'll come back to the context, just hear the words. This is a letter from Paul to a particular group of people. Here's what Paul says. Tell me, you who want to be under the law, are you not aware of what the law says? For it is written that Abraham had 2 sons, one by the slave woman and the other by the free woman. His son by the slave woman was born according to the flesh, but his son by the free woman was born as a result of a divine promise. These things are being taken figuratively. The woman represents 2 covenants. One covenant is from Mount Sinai and bears children who are to be slaves. This is Hagar. Now, Hagar stands for Mount Sinai, and corresponds to the present city of Jerusalem because she is in slavery with her children. But the Jerusalem that is above is free. And she is our mother. Holy mother. Okay, for it is written, be glad. Okay, for it is written. So he's quoting here Isaiah 54, verse 1. Be glad, barren woman, you have never bore a child. Shout for joy and cry aloud, you who were never in labor, because more are the children of the desolate woman than of her who has a husband. Now you, brothers and sisters, like Isaac, are children of promise. At that time, the son born according to the flesh persecuted the son born by the power of the Spirit. It is the same now. But what does Scripture say? Oh, God. Get rid of the slave woman and her son, for the slave woman's son will never share in the inheritance with the free woman's son. Therefore, brothers and sisters, we are not children of the slave woman, but of the free woman. Whew, that's exhausting.
Yeah, that's very powerful given
Now,
the context.
I have,
yeah.
on a first level, just looking at this, before we can get into the context, there's all kinds of things that pop out to me that I have issues with. First of all, the way he treats the slave woman.
Yeah, yeah.
In 2000, what are we, 19 now?
Yeah.
This is a conversation that we need to have. Now, beyond that, I also don't want to get distracted from what Paul is almost using this story as a metaphor for a larger point. And that's the context that I want to get into. So, Doug, talk to us a little bit about, this is obviously an epistle. It's a letter from Paul written to this particular church because there's a lot that's cooking. Tell me, give us a little bit of context around Peter, because you did a whole riff just now on Peter, Paul, and what you see. And this will unlock a lot of Paul's writings and even what Jesus was attempting to do when we understand the context in this particular group of Jewish people that he's dealing with.
Right. Context is obviously a huge key to the way you're going to interpret and view certain things that are written. And for Paul, there's a reason he was given a separate ministry than the ministry of Peter. Peter was given a ministry to work directly in Jerusalem. He was working there with a Jewish audience who were totally genealogically based, law-based, temple-based, priesthood, etc. And that's what Peter's ministry was to begin to help them see how they could move forward from that into the realm that Christ was bringing into existence. Now, Paul, on the other hand, was called to minister to the Gentiles who had never been under the law to begin with. And so for the Gentiles, the mission of Paul is to make sure that they understand this new realm of freedom, this God-given freedom of being a human in the image of God and breathed by God, that it was not in any way hampered or impeded by someone putting those Gentiles in Galatia and Rome and Ephesus and Corinth back under the law. So you had Jewish believers in Jerusalem that were literally going out to the Gentile congregations, and they were attempting to tell them that circumcision, law observance, feast days, foods that you can eat or not eat, calendar days, etc., that those were all part of necessary observances in order to be a follower of Christ, that you still had to do those things. Now, they did all those things in Jerusalem, but we got to remember Peter's job was to begin to wean them from that. Paul's job was to make sure the Gentiles, Cody, just never went back into it. So the Judaizers were coming out and they were saying, yeah, we're followers of Jesus in Jerusalem, but we still keep these elements of Moses. And it's and you should be keeping these elements of Moses too. Paul's job is to show them, no, Moses is not going to be the way in which God reveals the freedom and liberty that comes in this new heaven and earth.
So this isn't, because I don't want to oversimplify, because oftentimes when people hear that, they're like, oh, legalism. It's far deeper than that simplistic of a conversation. We're talking about circumcision. We're talking about Jewish food laws. We're talking about observing a Jewish calendar. And even deeper than that, this is also a very nationalistic, racial type situation going here, which I want to get into a minute, because this is the context in which you just heard Galatians 4, which erupts. It's no wonder when I read these things, I'm going, oh my God, no wonder they were irate at the guy. And then even with that, what you have is a particular group of Jewish people you call the Judaizers.
Yep.
And these Judaizers kind of had this belief that God had always worked through Jews, which he had, and that this means God was still working only through the Jewish nation, which was certainly not true. But the idea was that one must embrace the law as necessary if one wants to be acceptable to the divine.
Correct.
And Paul seems to be the one who says, I'm going to talk to this particular group of people over here, the Gentiles, and tell them that is not true. But you have Peter, who it seems to me in this moment, Peter is taking a very spiral dynamic approach.
Yeah.
Kind of meeting people at the stage in which they are.
Yes.
And trying to lead them out. Is that a fair assumption?
Yeah. He's doing exactly what you've done in your ministry. You look at any pastor that's out there today with all of the controversy of the various different challenges that are being presented in the religion of Christianity, it's the same situation, right, Cody? I mean, you've got all these pastors that are saying these have typically been boundaries for our particular group. There's just been posted this thing on the United Methodist Church and the boundary of the LGBTQ, which we've so many times referenced. You're talking about boundaries, and you're attempting to lead people beyond old boundaries. So Peter was working within the system. Paul was going out to people that had never been in the system to begin with. So that's why they had to operate separately, because you're going to have a different conversation with people that you're trying to take a step at a time into maturity versus people that have never had that problem to begin with. So that is the historical context of Peter and Paul. Yeah.
But you also see elements of Paul being very strategic about meeting people at the stage of consciousness in which they are.
Yes.
And that's actually some of the problem text with Paul, right?
Yeah, it is.
Generally, when you see Paul make statements and you're like, that guy was wrong.
Right.
Well, it's not that he didn't have an integral second-tier approach.
Right.
It's that he understood the process of evolution is a very gradual, slow, think seeds, not switches process.
Yes. So in Acts 21, Cody, Paul goes to Jerusalem, and Peter and James meet him because he's going there with a collection from the Gentiles so that they can extend the right hand of fellowship to the Jewish believers. And in Acts 21, it's fascinating that Peter and James are like, look, people are going to hear you're here in the city, and they're going to try to take you out. They're going to try to take your life because they know that you're teaching the Gentiles not to do any law observance whatsoever. So here's what you need to do, Paul. You need to take a Nazirite vow, go to the temple, shave your head, and do the necessary offerings that go with that. You would have expected Paul, who has told the Gentiles in every single city, Corinth, Ephesus, Galatia, etc., Rome, you'd have expected Paul to say, are you crazy? Take a Nazirite vow? Go to the temple? These are the very things I'm telling the Gentiles are no longer a part of what Christ is bringing into existence. But instead, Paul, the text says Paul went and did it. Why did Paul do that? Because Paul was in Jerusalem, and Paul knew, like we would, that if you're going to go over to the Middle East, and you're a woman, you're going to wear a head covering. Is that because you are saying, oh, yes, I am now of a religion that requires a head cover. No, you're doing that out of respect for the country in which you are now operating. And so this is a spiral dynamic principle for Paul. Eventually, though, where you're headed with this text, just so we can insert this commercial for people, where we're headed with this text is going to have everything to do with the nature of faith. And I'll make this teaser out there for a second, too, and that is the problem of leading Israel out of her religion is the same problem that we're talking about in terms of leading people out of any religion, including Christianity.
Let that sit. Don't rush into the next statement.
Yes.
That's great. Okay. That's the context of why you have this question in Paul's letter to the Galatians. You who want to be under the law, are you not aware of what the law says?
Yes.
Then he proceeds to do what any good first century teacher would do.
Yes.
He teaches from the Torah.
Yes.
For it is written, so he's quoting scripture, that Abraham had 2 sons. Okay, so now he's going into the story of Abraham and Abraham's 2 sons. And he says one was by a slave woman, the other was by a free woman. Okay, talk to us a minute about that. He's obviously talking about Hagar
Yes.
and Sarah.
Yes.
Okay, one was by a free woman, one was by a slave woman. So think about who he's talking to here.
Yes.
Again, he's dealing with Jewish believers that are forcing or adding to the teachings of Peter and Paul that the law is to be included on this.
Yes.
So he decides, I'm going to take their Torah,
Yes.
their scripture, and I want to show them what it was pointing to all along.
Yes.
And he does that through this story as a metaphor, as an example to say, here's what it's like. Abraham had 2 sons.
Yeah.
Sarah, Hagar. Sarah, slave,
Yes.
brought in.
Yeah.
Sarah was the one who, as the text goes on to say, was given this promise.
Yes.
And had Isaac. So
Right.
tell us a little bit about that story as he uses it in this context.
As he's using it, he first of all, the overriding principle that Paul is obviously getting here with slave and freedom language is he's talking about what it means to be in bondage. He's not talking about slavery per se, which was quite different in those days as a concubine or someone who worked in the house than what we think of in more modern times. But the point that Paul's trying to make is that there is bondage and there is freedom because slaves are in bondage. This idea of bondage, of course, goes all through the text. Israel herself was in bondage, and she goes into freedom when she moves away from Pharaoh. Jesus comes because of the bondage to sin and death. So the bondage theme is a huge part of this whole conversation. What puts you in bondage? And basically, again, we're going to get to in a little bit here why your own faith can actually put you in bondage.
So you see parallels between the story of Sarah and Hagar and Israel's journey through Egypt.
Yes, only Paul's swapping the roles on them. You
That's
see,
what's interesting. That's what I want to talk to you about because
Right.
I have a problem with that. Okay. So
right.
let's discuss this for just a minute. All right. I swear if you can't tell, I have so much fun on these podcasts, but I really have fun when I'm half into an unsweet tea. Okay.
Yeah.
Here's what's confusing to me.
Okay.
You have God as source and self as source.
Yes.
Those were the threads that we've been tracing from Abraham and Adam.
Yep.
It's almost like you see it here too, right?
Yeah.
Bondage and liberation.
Yeah.
Self as source, God as source.
Yes.
But he's using Sarah as the free woman
Yeah.
and Hagar, or by the way, it could be Hagar. I've heard some theologians pronounce it that way. Doesn't matter. Point is, as the slave woman, my problem with that is it was Sarah herself who demanded Abraham sleep with Hagar. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So it's almost like though she's represented as the free woman, she was the one who was, it seems selfish source was evident with her because she's the one going, we can't wait on the promises of God. It's never going to happen. And so I'm demanding that my slave sleep with you and force Ishmael to happen, this child to happen, because it's never going to happen with me. Doesn't that sound like selfish source trying to control the narrative?
There's no doubt it was, but we got to remember when that happened in the story. And again, this is why you read the context of the whole story. When that happened, Sarah and Abraham are having a private discussion about, okay, we're going to have a son. By the way, I'm 99 years old and I can't. Now from here we speculate, is it possible that Sarah and Abraham thought, as I often have, well, I'll tell you what we can do. Let's help God out here. Fulfill this promise, because I don't know how in the world this could happen any other way. You have a child through Hagar so God's promise can come true. Okay, now that is an attempt to control the situation, but on the other hand, it could actually be something that you try to do out of the goodness of your heart, which is basically, let me help you out, God. I'm not sure you could pull this off.
Totally.
Because the circumstances don't call for it. Now, after that child was born, God made it clear to Abraham and to Sarah that they were still going to have a son. And this is where we'll later in this conversation get into the fact that faith has so much to do with God being the one who can give life even from the dead, whether it's the deadness of Sarah's womb, whether it's the deadness of a corpse that lies 3 days in a tomb, but that is the point of God as source. So that's how that happened.
Because there is a promise made also to Hagar.
Yes, there is.
Which a lot of people don't talk about that.
No, they don't. Unless you're of the descendant of the Islam nation who traces their world religion through Ishmael, who is presented in the Jewish text as being the one who's of the slave, and they present Ishmael differently. So Abraham becomes the father of three world religions.
Yes, and that's where we're headed, and we're gonna shut it down right there. Before we get there, let me make two observations. One, I find it interesting that Paul quotes Isaiah 54:1. That to me traces it back to yet again this parallel between bondage and liberation and the children of Israel, which is interesting because he's quoting Isaiah, who is Isaiah in that particular text is talking about bringing hope to an Israel that had been exiled.
Yes,
and that's fascinating. Now, one of the things that he does is he again uses these Sarah and Hagar and says one covenant. So he gets into covenant. Okay. Just a point to make.
Yeah.
One covenant is from Mount Sinai.
Yep.
And he says that's Hagar.
Yep.
Okay. We've talked about this before, but then there's a new covenant, right?
Yeah.
And
second tier.
So there's Mount Sinai, first tier.
Yep.
And then there is what?
There's Zion,
Mount Zion, which is second tier.
City of God.
Yep.
Yes, Zion, city of God. That city that Abraham went out in by faith looking for a city whose builder and maker is God. When we get to Romans and do Romans study, we'll find out in Romans that salvation is tied to the event where the deliverer comes out of Zion. And we're not going to talk about that today, but just to let you know, this is it's oftentimes not people could grow up in church and never even have this conversation.
I was thinking about how many times we say, now we don't have time today to talk about this, but we'll talk about this later.
It's a technique I use knowing fully that I'll never talk about any of it.
Oh, man.
No, not really. I mean, we're trying to get to all of it, but because this is an integral story, that means that you have literally thousands of threads, all of which integrate when they're put in their proper context.
Okay. Again, keep in mind what Paul is dealing with here. Galatians 3:1 would be a perfect example. He says, you foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you, right? So this is context again. Keep in mind what's happening here. Now, that said, I want to go back to that statement you just said. The whole metaphor that Paul is using, and this is where things get real sticky. Okay. Take Peter, take Paul. It's been my observation, what has transpired is oversimplification which has been generalizations, which has not been good at all. That's why clarity is so important and context is so important.
Oh, yeah.
Because you hear language about Western white men colonizing other nations. And now we're getting into Judaisms, plural.
Yep.
And what has transpired in interpretations is a lot of folks leave seminary and they're going away with the law, away with Judaism.
Yes.
One of the problems is what you just said. They can't see what that means for Christianity.
Correct.
Right now.
Yeah.
But then it also comes about very anti-Semitic.
Of course it does. Because what they're saying is that Christianity, that God's eternal plan was to have one religion called Judaism, and then God would use Jesus to come and displace that religion and start a new religion called Christianity. And Christianity would be superior because
Christian privilege.
Christian privilege.
We've talked about that. And few people we want to talk about privilege, but it's all Christians talking about privilege, and no one wants to talk about Christian privilege.
Absolutely, because the saved, and we'll get into this in the next podcast a little bit about the Christian privilege idea.
Next podcast.
No, I have it for the notes, and I am making this promise to you as a listener. We will talk about Christian privilege in the next podcast.
Fulfill that promise?
I will fulfill the promise. Well, that's the way the spiral works. I have to do it now. This is a real problem. If you look at the promise to Abraham, think about it. The promise in the genesis of human spiritual consciousness, I will bless all the nations of the earth through you. You get to the end of the story, and John will say that in this new heaven and earth, they all that all nations walk in the light of the New Jerusalem. That sounds to me like the beginning and fulfilling of the whole story. And yet what we're saying today in history is this: God's plan was through Abraham not to bless all the nations, but to set up 3 world religions. Does that really make sense? So what we're saying is this is not to slam any particular religion. This is not to slam Islam. It's not to slam Judaism, and it's not to slam Christianity. What we're asking is there something that transcends the 3? Could they have all played a role and function in history to this point in time? Are we living in the process of an evolutionary shift where we now, understanding through spiral dynamics, an integral lens and perspective, can truly see just how amazing the writings of Paul and the teachings of Jesus were? Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yes. That's huge. So it's almost transcending all faith traditions.
Yeah, and some are not ready for that. And so they're like the people in Jerusalem. You should keep going to the temple. If that's where you are and that's what is satisfying your faith and what your faith is in, you should do that, or your denomination. It doesn't mean I agree with that, but what I'm saying is I understand that. I can understand and empathize that this is where you are in your journey, and also understand that it's okay. And this is what we're going to get to in the salvation part of it. And that is, how can everybody be okay? That's a topic that we'll continue to hit on.
Yeah, and we didn't even get to this line, but it is a line that get rid of the slave woman and her son.
Yeah.
For the slave woman's son will, now this is interesting, never share in the inheritance with the free woman's son.
Because self as source can never bring its works to God and say, look what I've done. And God say, okay, now I accept you. It will never happen on that basis.
But what's really interesting is how the story ends with Hagar, which is so metaphorical for even those who don't have faith.
Right.
And those who do subscribe to the law.
Oh, yeah.
That this ending is, it's funny, no man has seen God. Well, there's been a woman who has.
Yeah, exactly.
Hagar. And she has this experience with the divine. Oh, you could just go on and on. And that's just 20 minutes of Galatians 4. So, all right, we got to stop there. Next week, we'll go to Galatians 2, and we'll talk about justification by faith, and then all the other things that you made promises to our people about. All right?
Good deal. I'm ready.
All right. Have a good week.
Thank you for joining us today. If you have any questions or comments, please contact us at info@presence.tv. You can also visit our website at presence.tv or find us on Facebook. We look forward to hearing from you.